Should we roll?
All right, so we have a special guest with us here today. Shari was busy with holiday plans for family that's coming to visit and wasn't able to make it. So we have Dr. Matthew Milliner with us this
Or
morning.
Shari knew the topic and said, "I'm slipping out of this."
Yeah.
She's
And
smart.
yes, today we tackle letter 15, the devil. There we go. There's our illustration right away.
Right there.
Is that where we want to start? Do we just want to dive into the phenomenology of the card?
No.
Open up to. Okay, where do you want to start? Let's go. Let's get it going.
Okay, I think we should start where we should start. What is your position on the existence of Satan or the devil or whatever you want to call it, or the dark forces? I'm asking you guys.
You're asking us.
Yeah,
that's
Okay.
easy. I mean, that's easy.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, we my PhD student friend of mine, when we were in grad school, we had a rule that if at any point in the academic study of theology we begin to doubt in the existence of demons or angels, we've been in this too long and we have to get out. It just seems astonishing that people would be so out of step with the wide witness of all human civilizations to completely discount. It's the ultimate conceit of modernity.
Yeah.
To disbelieve in those entities. And then someone comes along and tries to play a sophisticated move and says, yes, but, and that's exactly what Tom Berg does. He has all of these gradations and sophistications to perfectly meet people in that ground and say, I understand that there are egregores. I understand that there are astral creations, but of course he's not going to give up in the angelic hierarchies. So for me, that's
okay.
That's that's where I begin. Yeah. What about you, Nate?
Yeah, I do. And well, for me, it's okay. So I've never not been open about this. So I've talked about before on the program that my vision of Sophia that I had that I didn't know what anything to do with in my early 20s. And it took me like decades before I had any framework to do anything with it. But I also had encounters with things that were not nice.
Yeah.
And so for me those were experiential, like directly experiential. So when I was still a materialist, I encountered those things and was shocked out of my materialism.
Wow.
So,
and I think you meet people who have that level of experience, and then sometimes it turns into a sort of competition. Well, here's my supernatural experiences, and here's you never want to get into that because then it gets kind of creepy too.
Yeah.
But you just have this profound reverence that Tom Berg assumes from the beginning of this chapter, so much so that he precisely does not do that. What's amazing about this chapter, it's not a demonology. In fact, he specifically avoids that.
Yeah, actually,
because he's like, I'm not going to do that because you cannot ever know what evil is because it has no positive essence. And so it is such profound respect for the power of evil. And then he goes into a whole nother unexpected category discussion.
On that point about the ontology of evil, there's a great line that I highlighted. He says one can grasp profoundly, i.e. intuitively, only that which one loves. Love is the vital element of profound knowledge, intuitive knowledge. Now one cannot love evil. Evil is therefore unknowable in its essence. One can understand it only at a distance as an observer of its phenomenology. So that's why you can't. That's why he says you can't construct an accurate hierarchy of evil.
And that's why he says this is unlike all the other meditations in that, the last thing he wants us to do is identify with the subject on the card, right?
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Well,
and the other thing, when you get to this page and you're like, he has all these great epigraphs, and like, here's the epigraph for this page, for this letter.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I read that, I was like,
I
whoa.
noticed that.
Isn't that wild?
I actually tend to go back and look at the epigraph after I've read the chapter, so I can kind of see, because I usually find the epigraph more illuminating if I wait until after I've read the chapter, and then I'm like, oh, that's why he used that.
That's what he was getting at.
So that's what I did. Then I'm like, oh, of course, there's not one. That makes total sense.
Yeah, it's like an anti-demonology, if anything, or I mean, that comes not out of disbelief, but probably I would suspect out of experience in his case.
Yeah, I think so. And he gives some very practical ways to deal with these things, which is really helpful. The other thing that I was thinking is that in our culture, pop culture, even right, even academic, maybe academic culture, but certainly popular culture or the popular imagination. People will affirm the existence of angels or even fairies, right? But when you get to demons, they're like, they're just pleading ignorance or something. They don't even go there. They don't even want to talk about it, right?
But here's the thing.
I think it's important.
Well, here's the thing, though. There's like to me, there's a huge ecumenical opening in acknowledging the reality of these things, because it's not like the belief in good and evil spirits is absolutely universal. Like you can't find any religion that has ever existed in the history of our world that doesn't have some notion of good and evil spirits.
Well, I know, but in our culture, it's weird. We're sociopaths, we're just disordered. Our culture in our relationship.
I'm going to give an interesting example of that ecumenicism that exists in acknowledging the reality of these entities. Robert E. Howard, not a very Christian writer, but he had a character, Solomon Kane, right? Solomon Kane was a Puritan's Puritan. But in his adventures, in his battles against evil, he teamed up with a tribal shaman, a witch doctor, in order to fight those forces, even though he was a Puritan.
All right.
Interesting.
So before we jump in, share some trivia with you guys. So last month, a little bit over a month ago, I was in Washington, D.C. for a conference on the Brothers Karamazov. And so I got there early to the hotel. I got there a few hours early, and I had some time to kill. And it was in Georgetown. And I said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk down to the Exorcist stairs. That scene at the end of The Exorcist where Father Damien jumps through the window after he asks the demon to possess him, and the priest comes there and gives him the absolution, which is a beautiful scene. But so I wanted to see it, right? So because that movie traumatized me so badly when I was 14. So I walked down there and I walked past it because it's so easy to miss. It's basically in a really junky parking lot at the bottom of the stairs. And I'm walking by there and I passed it by, and I'm up with my map thing and my phone. I'm like, where'd it go? I didn't see it. So I turn out and I go back to it. And then when I was there, there's the steps. They were back about 30 feet from the sidewalk. So I go over there, I want to take a picture, and there are these two Irish women there, tourists, and where I started talking to them. I said, we have to take, and they're about my age, so we have to take this picture because of what this did to us when we were kids, don't we? So we take a picture of the Exorcist stairs.
So in light of what you just said, and about how, especially since you said it traumatized you as a kid,
it did.
What is like? So I've seen interesting arguments amongst Christians about like what Christian attitude toward horror should be. Where do you think Tom Berg, based on what he says in the chapter, would come down on that?
I had the same experience with American Werewolf in London. Yeah. My psyche is still traumatized by that TV scene where they're watching the Muppets and a happy little family, and demons come in and start to kill them. And that got into my consciousness way too early. I cannot, I've thought about watching it again. I can't.
Yeah.
And so what I have to do is just, you use the precise skills that Tom Berg unfurls on this, which is active imagination. And, maybe one day if I have, some time to do some soul house cleaning, I'll invite Jesus into that. It's going to take some time and so all of this is fixable. it's not incapacitating me, but all those skills that we farm out to the technocracy,
Right.
Christians should be able to do that. And so
You mean we should still be casting out demons?
Oh, well, sure, but I mean, I would farm that out too. But no, I'm saying simply learning the skills of active imagination that he assumes in this chapter, that Jungians recovered, that Tibetan Buddhists have been practicing for millennia, and that Christians, of course, have their own version of, that is incredibly powerful. That's part of the undergirding of this chapter. But all that to say, I mean, I think that's precisely what this isn't. It's not a manual on exorcism. You guys know Monsignor Stephen Rossetti, The Diary of an American Exorcist? Because there's been an uptick in exorcisms lately.
Yeah.
And he got kind of tasked with that. And he'll have these like Instagram reels where he'll talk about, here's all the things I learned from the demons. That's exactly, and that's fine, but that's exactly what Tomberg is not doing.
Right.
He just brackets.
But he's still talking. But he's still talking about casting out demons. He's just talking about how do you really cast out demons. He's saying that you cast out demons by allowing good to be present, by bringing.
Oh, isn't it good? Right, not some ritual, but just the presence of.
That's what I meant. That's what I meant.
I got you. No.
So there's a problem, but this is good, Matthew, because you that's really at the core of the problem, because neither like the materialist disbelief in these entities is helpful for Christians, nor is the kind of materialist process casting of demons particularly good.
And I think
interesting.
Another thing that's really super useful, and actually I think probably one of the more useful things I've even got from this book over the course of my life reading it, is this really useful taxonomy of the different categories of these kinds of evil entities that he provides. When I figured out what an egregore is, for instance, that was like, oh, this explains so much of what happens in the world, in politics, and even in academic politics.
Totally.
Yeah. And
people don't have a category for that. And it does so much conceptual work. It has so much, as John Henry Newman would say, explanatory power. You're like, oh, there's this. I mean, I remember getting an interview once at a company, and the guy just kind of said to me, companies are kind of like dragons. And I was like, what? And he's like, well, they kind of become a thing and they consume people. And I was like, first of all, I didn't take the job, but it was just this common parlance. And you sense that the spirit of an institution. Right. And what's so interesting is Tomberg is so, I don't want to say sophisticated, because that sounds like he's making it up. I think he's so accurate that he's saying, here's what an egregore is. And here's kind of the spirit. He realizes there are artificial demons, not at the expense of fallen angels, but almost like, in a sense, we do the work of demons when humans collectively imagine and create this constellating fear that then drives us. And now, of course, we've outsourced that to the companies, right? And I think demons are kind of kicking back, like, hey, this is great. The algorithms are doing our work. we can go on vacation, but you get the idea. It's complicated. But really, he is so subtle in saying that there are those things, and then there are these egregores, and he's like, let's precisely monitor how they're created and how they can be dispelled. And it is the job of believers in every age to stand against them. Right. Isn't that just powerful?
And and it's only the egregores really that we can cast out, because he sees the hierarchies of the left as being essentially protected from being, because they play a role in the divine plan.
Now, Nate, can I stop there for a second? Because some of the listeners, it took me a while to figure out what he meant by hierarchies of the left. Does he simply mean hierarchies of the right would be the classic hierarchies of good angels, and hierarchies of the left are the bad angels, the fallen angels?
Fallen angels, yeah.
Yeah, he does. It's funny. It's like he doesn't, maybe he explained that later and I forgot, but that's really helpful. So that's not what he's talking about here.
Yeah, and
He-
their prohibition against killing, like like Satan can do anything to Job against but kill him, right? This is something
yeah,
that distinguishes the hierarchies of the left from egregores,
there we go.
to which human beings sacrificed.
Yes. Yes. And it's really wonderful as an art historian. We, the secular discipline of art history doesn't really have I hope people, half the listeners didn't fall asleep when I go in this academic exercise, but it is relevant. If you're ever on a tour somewhere, this, in somewhere to look at Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, this will help you. He says that, if we just have the hierarchies of the left, we just have the demonic, then you jump too quickly to explanations for, oh, look, the demon of Dionysus,
Right.
on my trip to Greece, it must have been a demon. Or, you just hear these Christians with they believe in demons, thank goodness, but they have these flat understandings. They just say, oh yeah. Like you hear people say, well, talking about Islam, like, oh, Allah must be a demon. I'm like, what are you talking about? You have no sophistication here.
Right.
And the egregore is this intermediate concept. He could say Quetzalcoatl is a construction of Mayan culture collectively, and it helps you understand art history. It helps you understand the oppressive hierarchies of Assyrian art that you see at the Metropolitan Museum of Art without just saying, oh, it must be a demon, which is just so
Well, that's kind of how he ends this
oafish way of
that's actually
approaching.
how he ends this chapter, is talking about like distinguishing the different forms of paganism, and he makes it very clear
So
that not
good.
all paganism was in service to egregores.
Exactly. And this, by the way, is why I found Michael's meditations on Dionysus so effective, because it's not, oh, it's demonic, let's get rid of it. It's, here's a Christian reclamation of the Dionysian wine god Christian tradition. And Tomberg lays out that framework. Maybe at that point, Michael, Tomberg had influenced you.
Probably. I don't think it was conscious when I wrote that about that. I think I was. Well, I think what I got from Tomberg that probably contributed to that was similar to what I got from Soloviev, is that, as Balthazar says of Soloviev, is that Gnosticism was purified through him, through the streams of Christianity, right? And I think that's what Tomberg's service in a way is here. Right?
And Bulgakov finished the job.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he said, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying, and with regard to anthroposophy, the purification was incomplete. Tell us more.
Well, I think as you were talking about, as we see this kind of knee-jerk, it's a demon, like church lady Christianity, right?
Yeah, which it could be.
It could be.
We have that
that's
category.
always that's the go-to, right?
Yeah.
Could it be Satan?
Yeah.
But he doesn't go there first. He goes to the anthropops first, because I've been around anthropops most of my adult life, and there is a real problem with obsessing too much about evil and Lucifer and Aram and the Asuras, right? Which is why he calls them. It's the first thing he does in this letter.
He calls it clips their wings.
Yes. I'm clipping your wings, baby.
Yeah.
Well, no, he said they clip their own wings with their obsession at evil.
Yeah.
So in other words, if we want to see why Tomberg converts from anthroposophy, we are in the letter that explains that maneuver, is because they're too casually obsessed with evil, whereas I have the reverence to not engage that. And if I got too obsessed with it, then I would still be an anthroposophist and not be able to have these dazzling moves.
Yeah, it basically really says that the problem is that they've allowed everything to either fall into the category of the Luciferic or the Aramonic, so there's no good left.
Well, right. and of course, that's the other problem, is that, and he experienced this firsthand. I don't know if you guys know this. Around the time he was kind of chased out of the Anthroposophical Society, because after Steiner died, and this was only 10 years after, maybe 15.
Yeah, it was in the 30s.
Where they kind of chased him out. But also anthroposophy was having some big internal power struggle problems, that's in egregore, right? he's
Totally.
dealing with the egregore of anthroposophy in that case, because Rudolf Steiner was no longer around.
Right. Right.
And Rudolf Steiner, he was
It was an orphaned egregore.
well, he was always depressed because he couldn't believe, all these people who don't get what I'm trying to teach them, tell them not to look to me as a guru. But what should we do? Really, it's almost like that scene in The Life of Brian when he loses his shoe. I will take off my shoe in imitation of him. So they were doing all this stuff, and he's like, knock it off. Oh, and and you still find that in Waldorf schools, anthroposophical centers. But it's inescapable in groups.
Yeah.
Like that, especially spiritual groups too. They all gender their own egregore. They just do. I mean, the English department where I used to teach, it generated its own egregore. I mean, it can't be avoided.
Right.
It cannot be avoided.
I mean, Tomberg says the church generates an egregore.
Exactly.
That's the egregore of the church is what's responsible for the Inquisition.
But it's such a crucial distinction, because he says the church can generate a negative egregore, but the church itself is not one.
Right.
Correct.
And so he'll say Francis, not an egregore. Mary, not an egregore. These are spiritual presences that can, in fact, dissipate negative egregores that accumulate like cancers in a given institution. And it really does remind me, as we're pointing this out, that your job, listener, in an organization or even in a family dynamic might be to confront a collective fear that is accumulated over generations, right? That your job is to bring your presence of love and light to dissipate it. And citizens of institutions who responsibly do that, sometimes at great cost to themselves, are the heroes, right? And we all know it, like, gosh, that person's a really good leader. Like, that person really did the hard work in the committee to confront this idea that is killing this place.
Yeah.
And that's what I think our job is, to confront that. So having I never had the category of egregore until I read this. And then you start to realize this isn't a secularization of the demonic and the angelic. It's just this necessary move that falls under the gradations that Paul gives us in Ephesians 6 of hierarchies and authorities and principalities and powers. It's like, it's really, really effective.
He's also talking about not just egregores too, but kind of our personal demons, right? Which, and he brings Jung into the conversation to talk about, like, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about various psychoses, is that we're essentially talking about personal demons. And actually, one of the other ways to approach the way Tomberg talks about egregores here is to think about the phenomenon of mass formation, psychosis. Like, that's what an egregore is,
and that's his major. I mean, he lived through it, right? So not just in anthroposophy, but when he became Catholic, he was living in a camp for displaced persons because of the Nazis. Right.
That's
and communism. He's people. So many of my friends in academic or intellectual circles are like, well, I kind of rough on Marx, but I mean, you talk to people who actually lived through it, like Valentin Tomberg, or a really good friend of mine who's actually a member of our CSA. She's from East Germany, and when she saw a lot of the stuff that was going on for the last 3 years, goes, Michael, I cannot stand this. This is what I left. I left this. I came to this country to get away from this. But you can see, and that's why I taught this last semester. I taught this course on, I think it was on writing theory, but one of the books I used was Edward Bernay's book on propaganda, because talk about egregores and generated demons, right? Convince people, and that's the thing. What happens is, I think, so whether say it's through propaganda, and I think he gives a great example of this. We're like, Nate, you were just talking about, so we all have to deal with our own, I wouldn't even call them personal demons, but personal stuff, our histories that we have to transcend or have to work through. There's that. Then we also, at the same time we're doing that, especially as you get to be an adult, but even teenagers, I think, deal with this. You're learning to deal with egregores in various situations in which you find yourself. Whether
Well, the
it's a
reason
church
I said
community.
personal demons is because Tom Berg does make a point of emphasizing the fact that they do have some agency and almost seem to be like another personality within the personality that
Right.
overrides the agency of the primary
The
personality.
complex. The
Right.
complex.
So, but
Yeah.
So
and
that's why I said
that's why he
personal.
turns to Jung, right? But
Yeah.
so the thing I'm saying is, so you have on one level that, and we all deal with that through our whole lives, you know, it comes back, stress or whatever. Then the egregore thing. But then he points out in it's on page 412 in my book. It says, in other words, beginners have to struggle against the second movement of the body, whilst the more advanced have to deal with demons and with hierarchies of the left. So it's it's and what I thought of is Martin Luther King, who he's a great example of that, of dealing with all of those at the same time. So he had his own weaknesses that he was, that the CIA and the FBI were capitalizing on to destroy him, but he was also had the egregores of his time that he was contending with. But
that
in a
killed
letter
him. That killed him. Yeah,
it did. And in a letter from his father, I think this is during the Montgomery bus boycott. His father wrote to him and said, "I hope you are much in prayer, because it is just men such as you that the evil one tries to capture." Right?
Exactly.
So and that's how I think it goes. You know.
Yeah, and and if you have, and it is fascinating to me how, gosh, even what's his name? No, the point is, people who wishful thinking, trying to think of Martin Luther King as a secular figure. It's just a laughable enterprise.
Yeah.
I'm sure, you know, you can find stuff. Yes, he was trained by Niebuhr. Yes, there was a sort of a Protestant liberal secularized Christianity, but he had more than that.
And
there are many instances. Oh, totally. Many instances of his using contemplative practice in order to push the movement forward.
Yeah, do you know that story about him? Not to get too sidetracked on to Martin Luther King, but I think it was during the Montgomery bus boycott, and he was under a lot of pressure from everybody. And you know, this is before caller ID, and they'd get phone calls, and they said, "You're going to be dead tomorrow," right?
I remember this. Yes, this is the one.
And
he
was going to. He said, he had little kids, right? Matt knows what this is like, you know. So does Nate, right? We have little children. I can't put my children in harm's way. So he was he just woke up in the middle of the night, couldn't get back to sleep, put some coffee on, and he starts praying, and he said, I can't do this. I can't do this. I'm going to hand it off to Ralph Abernathy. While he's praying, he heard a voice that said, "Martin Luther, trust in me, and I will be with you to the end of the world."
Yeah.
And he said from that moment forth, he wasn't worried about himself. And he knew nothing would happen to his children. The next day, he was at a meeting. The phone rings, and Martin, there's been an explosion at your house. And he knew his family was okay, but the porch was blown up. But he knew his family was okay.
And none of that was taught to him in his Protestant liberal education.
And none of that is talked about now in celebrations of Martin Luther King Day, for instance.
Right, exactly. We made him a secular saint, which is anything like what he was.
Exactly.
So,
well, you know, it's funny you should say that, Matthew, because I just had I work for the state of Washington, which is like kind of gone in a particularly
the egregore of Washington.
Yeah, the egregore of Washington state has gone in a particular ideological direction, but one of the events that I did take an opportunity to participate in as a Washington State employee was we had Cornel West come and talk to us. And the difference between what Cornel West was saying when he talked to us and what the administration is actually trying to implement as a policy, it's like, no. There's a spirit behind. There's a real hierarchical spirit behind what Cornel West is talking about and what Cornel West wants to do. But what the state of Washington is trying to do is definitely influenced by an egregore. It was just,
interesting. Yeah, I just
contrast was so obvious, and it's like, you know, the higher ups who were in the conversation with them, it's like they kept nodding their heads in agreement, but it's like, okay, but that's not what you're doing. Look at what you're actually doing with your policy. So
my experience with Cornel West, because he was at when I was in grad school, he was there. It just more and more Jesus.
Yeah, right.
And when he more and more Jesus, like he did what he needed to do, and then he was coming to Wheaton. I was just like, I was so tired of his shtick, right? Because as a more aggressively Christian person, I was like, come on, Professor West. And I kind of told students, they're like, oh, we're so excited, Professor West is coming. And I was like, well, and then he came and there was so much Jesus.
Yeah.
And I was like, this guy's changing. And maybe a place like Wheaton, the Jesus can come out of him. And it was an epic talk. And then I love telling the story. Student raised his hand and said, oh, Professor West, and white student, what should I do about my privilege? I'm so tortured. And Professor West said, deploy it. Next question. It's like, that's so great. Anyway, there's a lot of Christianity that came forth like never before. That's who he is.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
So quick, let's I'm really tempted, Nate. I want to hear more about your experiences with these entities you described, but at the same time, I am wary. I don't want to succumb to the temptation that Tom Berg avoids. So I'll withdraw that question.
I'll give you a really quick. They are all about wanting you to despair.
That's it.
They want you to despair. They want to rob you of all hope.
Yeah,
that is what it is.
And guys, I'm sorry, I hate to say this, but it really is interesting to listen to Monsignor Stephen Rossetti, because he'll tell these stories of like, the demons have to tell you the truth in these exorcisms, and they'll say, and they say they hate John Paul II, and they said, and he asked him, in the name of Jesus Christ, tell me the truth. Why do you hate him? He disrupted our plans. I mean, it's just really interesting things that, and again, I worry that I get a little. I get sucked into the drama of it, but I don't know if you've experienced this, but whenever I am reminded of the reality of the demonic, it's sort of like when it's snowy outside and you go around the fire at home and you're reminded of the dangers and risks in the spiritual world. You draw closer to the light of Christ. You draw closer to the structures of Christianity that protect you. You draw closer to the Psalms. Of course, he references the great exorcising chants of the Psalms in this chapter. And you're reminded we're protected and we are hunted beings. We are hunted beings. And it's just always for me important to remember that. And he is irradiated with that consciousness. And only from the center of the church do you have the authority to confront. And you never should seek out the confronting. This is where evangelicals and Pentecostals and charismatics really blew it. I mean, they would go to some hotel room before a revival and challenge the principality and power of Denver. I mean, what world-class arrogance to try to take on the spiritual realm in that way. The presence
of demons where none were present too. That's
a huge problem.
Like that's what part of the legacy of colonialism is, like just like missionaries going and assuming the presence of demons like de facto.
And my favorite story about this is Richard Twiss, a wonderful Christian convert from who is Lakota and stayed Lakota, of course, after he became a Christian. And he had these evangelical women come up to him and said, you just have to take off that regalia, take off those beautiful earrings, because let me tell you a story. Once we went to a reservation and we purchased these earrings, and then we had these horrible nightmares, and we knew that it was some spirit in a talisman, like infesting the earring. We went to the river and threw it in the river, and the earring jumped out of, popped back along the river back to them. And we knew it was possessed. And so here's the story, right? And this is Twiss's reply. It's so subtle. He said, you know what? I believe you're right. I think that very well may have been the case with those earrings, but these are consecrated in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. So don't say that about these. I'm like, exactly. He didn't deny the possibility of the demonic. He knows the darkness of his culture and all cultures, not just his, right? But he knows that the possibility of the redemption of those cultures.
But and all cultures have contact with egregores and angels.
Yes, exactly. Guys, I'm tempted to talk about active imagination. Do you want to go down that road?
Sure, go for it.
Because he really seems so I think like one of the golden threads through the whole book is what he does in the previous letter. And I think what he means by the clipping of the wings of the anthroposophists is they're unable to navigate the spiritual realm effectively and safely because of their underestimation of the power of evil. And so over and over again, I mean, when he refers to the Tibetan Buddhist practice of generating and dissolving demons, he's referring to this ability we have that the occult cultivates of generating these beings, and which when you intentionally do that, you could accidentally bring an egregore into existence that then you can't control. And that's the phenomenology of the card. It's not, here's a demon that's chaining them. The two little children are the parents.
Yeah.
They're the parents of the demon that now binds them, which is a wonderful illustration of any ideology, not just an academic ideology or any kind of addictive. You created the chains.
Right. It's
that you're in.
Monster, right?
Yeah. Right. Precisely. And you just imagine Jesus breaking those chains as he does with the demoniacs. And one of the tools that Jungians have recovered, but again, and I mentioned this in our conversation with Michael yesterday, I'm just like utterly, I mean, I almost laughed out loud when I heard some Jungians say, and then Jung created the practice of active imagination. I'm like, no, this has been on. I mean, for goodness sakes, it's been on offer.
Loyola,
right. And Jung knew it from Ignatius, gave lectures on Ignatius. He's like, this guy gets it. This guy created practices where you can imagine yourself with Jesus. And so I could go back to that memory. Again, it's not that traumatic, but I easily could do that work if I cultivate that. Lord, come meet me in that wound of my childhood. And when you know how to do that, it's an incredibly powerful tool that is sort of profoundly underutilized in the contemporary Christian church. But this is the quote I want to share. And again, we can get into Tibetan Buddhism because they're really good at it, but it has some issues too. But it also, there's a lot Christians can learn from it. And there's some really bad experiments in trying to fuse Christianity and Tibetan Buddhism that have completely failed. A quick, I don't know where I got this analogy. I read it somewhere. It might have been, I don't think it was in one of Michael's books. Share it with me if it is. I think it was probably in a William Johnston book, but it was the story of beekeeping. And so this person was trying to describe the failure of Alan Watts in his kind of utterly catastrophic attempt to bring Anglicanism and Buddhism together that ended up blowing up because Alan Watts started to sleep with his own students and wanted a libertine sexual lifestyle. And so he couldn't bring Christianity along with him. And then you have more and more examples of this. And I'm thinking of this recent book, Christian Tantra, that's a total, I mean, it's
oh my God,
really bad. Oh, it's just, and so this more, let's imagine it's William Johnston, I think, who said this, who had a lifetime of responsible cultivation of conversation. He said, when a beekeeper tries to marry a hive to another hive, if you don't do it right, the two hives will get in a war and all the bees will die. That's so right. you know, because you've actually experienced it.
I've actually done that before too. Yeah.
Wow. And so he said, what happens is you have to let the bees out bit by bit and let them get to know each other. And he said, what has happened in these aggressive attempts to fuse Christianity and Buddhism is the destruction of both hives. Double belonging is just, it's a joke. You have to be so careful as you move in this direction, as you cultivate and learn, okay, the Tibetan Buddhists are really good at cultivating these demonic energies. Can we learn from that at all? Or And what so strikes me about this chapter is he's so delicate and cautious in the sense in which he approaches the practice of tantric Buddhism. He's like, okay, here's what they're doing. He has great caution about it, which is precisely the kind of caution that so many Christians lack. It takes tremendous patience, resolve, prayer, and grounding in the Eucharist, grounding in the sacraments, grounding in the differences. And this is exactly what Tomberg has that so many of his, people today don't.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to circle back around to the anthroposophists for a moment. I wonder if what caused the problems is for them forgetting what Steiner said about the principle of reverence.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's not also what's in these sort of over hasty attempts to take two traditions that are totally different and rapidly bash them together doesn't show a lack of reverence for both at the same time. So a lack of reverence might be cause for that catastrophe as well.
I have an insider observation on that one.
Okay.
So I don't think it was that as much as an application of dogmatism. They turn Rudolf Steiner, everything he said, into the canon, into dogma. And because of that, that creates an egregore. Now,
but isn't that
certainly,
the hallmark
I have
of all
learned a
egregores?
whole bunch about reverence, more about reverence in Waldorf and anthroposophical circles, unfortunately, than I have very often in Christian circles.
Seriously, wow.
Because they really, especially with the kids, I mean, I don't know if they're doing it anymore, but when we used to do, we just had St. Lucy's Day the other day, and one of the most profound experiences of my life is I was really in a dark space. As when I first started as a Waldorf teacher, I was totally broke, and in fact, I had just come from bankruptcy court. I was 29 years old, and I get to school, and it was about 10 o'clock, or maybe not even 10 o'clock yet. And I was walking up to the classroom where I was the assistant. And as I was walking up, the second graders were walking down the stairs with their Santa Lucia stuff. So they had the one little girl with the candles on her head, and their other children had coffee and biscuits and cookies and stuff. And the teacher saw me and she said, "Michael, stop." And right there on the stairway, they gave me this, right? And the children were singing. It was beautiful. It was a healing moment for me after that kind of traumatic morning I had. So they're really, they're profoundly, at least they used to be, attentive to trying to bring children to a sense of reverence, right? And very good at it, and at least be really good at it anyway. Because children want that, and they don't get it in this culture so much. But I think what happens in the greater movement is it's very intellectual. And because it's very intellectual, it can be arid, and it can be disconnected from the real, right? Not on purpose, but I think that's just what happens through kind of an intellectual. And it's like academia, right? It's like a contest to see who knows more arcane crap.
Oh, Lord help us, yeah.
Right? And
when that happens, doesn't that come along with losing a sense of reverence? Like the minute you're
completely, well, then it becomes reverence, becomes sanctimoniousness, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And can we just say, like, anthroposophy and Jungianism, there are parties in both of those movements that want to de-Christianize, right? Absolutely. Whatever's left of the Christianity, whereas the Christianity is what gives both movement force and life.
Exactly.
And can we forgive both Steiner and Jung for their perhaps, more than occasional unorthodoxies, but nevertheless, they were desperately bringing to Christianity something that they had neglected, whether it's the maps of the psyche in the case of Jung, which Christianity long had on offer, but we had burned them up.
Yep.
And in the case of Steiner, I mean, thank God my kids now are waking up to cinnamon buns and coffee and candles around the table on December 13th. And it's of course, right. And if anthroposophy had to come along to try to fix that, there is a parallel here, isn't there? What Jung does to Freud, Steiner did to Theosophy.
Absolutely.
Right? Mm-hmm. It's just, let's bring this along, make it one step closer to Christianity. And when it comes to, this is all I wanted to say in regard to active imagination. When it comes to reverence, like your slapdash podcasting Jungian is not going to have this. So this is from a book by a Christian Jungian, Robert Johnson, Inner Work. Oh man, he has some stories. He was in Calcutta once, and he said, I was in absolute despairing of the poverty, which is a lot. You talk to a lot of people in India who have this experience, and he said, the bottom fell out. And I'm a depth psychologist. I know how to get myself out of this, but I couldn't, and so I was done. And I'm wandering the street, gasping for air psychologically. And I knew that there was a custom in Indian society that you could walk up to anyone and you could say, will you be the incarnation of God for me? That's like the emergency lever that you can pull. And so he said, I pulled it, and I saw a man across a park, randomly saw a man, walked up to him. He looked like he was completely Indian. He didn't have any, he's just normal Indian garb on. And he said, do you speak English? He said, yes. I'm sorry to do this, but will you be the incarnation of God for me? Yes. Robert Johnson pours out his soul to this guy and explains everything. And the guy listened with reverence and attention, and he just immediately felt better. Like that's the gift of human exchange. And then he was so grateful. He said, oh, by the way, tell me about yourself. What do you do? I'm a Roman Catholic priest.
How about that?
Isn't that amazing? So all this to say, regard to Johnson.
No, that's such a great story.
Isn't that
that's
astonishing?
Such a great story.
In the middle, it's like what, less than 1% of the population of India.
And what's funny thing is that act, that custom, that is precisely what Tomberg labels as intuition. Like that's what he says intuition is.
Yeah,
it's what sacred magic is.
Yeah,
right. And
really.
And it's there. And I feel like, I say in the same. So Robert Johnson really got into Hindu mythology toward the end of his career, and he does so under the principles that Tomberg lays out of finding the positive within it, not just flatly dismissing it all as demonic. But this is what I was saying in regard to reverence and active imagination, which is a big undergirding of this chapter. Because if you want to dissolve an egregore, it's quite a thing to confront an egregore that is a national dynamic, right? And we can fight in way, and it kind of helps me. I must admit, as I'm reading this, I like, Michael, you're pretty aggressive on Twitter, and I'm like, I see, like, it almost, he seems to be underwriting your like attacking, hey, I don't buy this. So that's one dynamic. But when it comes to your own personal use of these tools, which might be new for some Christians if they haven't gone through the Ignatian exercises, right, which will teach that to you.
Yeah.
I think the quickest way to do it is to go to Pray As You Go, with a great website done by these Irish Jesuits, and they have retreats, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, Advent retreats right now, where they will teach you active imagination with accents, which is what makes it so awesome. It's really nice to hear those Irish accents as you listen to the scriptures, but they really will guide you through it. But this is this is an astonishing passage that I want to read to you. So he talks about dream work, which is in some senses difficult but elementary in comparison to active imagination. Mm-hmm. And he starts by saying this. He's like, this is from a lot of experience in the office with patients. In the pages ahead, we will be exploring the art of active imagination and learning 4 steps for working with it. Before we begin, there is a fundamental precaution that everyone must take. Before starting active imagination, be sure that there is someone available for you to go to or call in case you become overwhelmed by the imagination and can't cut it off. Dang. And so he's saying, and then he walks through it. He's like, I have had many cases where somebody learns how to do this and they can't control it. And they're followed around by the little egregore that they generated in their counseling session. He's like, you need help. Careful, be cautious. Go to this with prayer. That's how powerful the image-making capacity that God has implanted in humans made in the image of God is.
Right.
It just gets out of control. And so, but thank God that skill, that talent, that charism has been consecrated for centuries in the Christian tradition. That was a conversation stopper.
No, I was
I was just
I'm
sitting
processing
with it
that
for
a little
moment.
bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
No, I think it's true, and I think like the danger is, I mean, in fact, here I don't know if you're familiar with this. So, but I've been in my doctoral dissertation. I have a chapter on John Dee in his
Oh yeah,
conversations
I
with
know it well.
angels, right?
Yeah.
Well, when they weren't angels, but they said they were, right? And I
Yeah.
always tell people it's like it's like calling up, dialing random 10 numbers on the phone and going, I want to talk to Jesus, and the demons are like, he thinks it's Jesus. Jesus speaking, you know what I mean? And
Or it's like going into the jungle and saying, I'd like to encounter wildlife.
yes. So, but
What's
that's what
gonna go?
happened with
What could
John
go
Dee.
wrong? Yeah.
And when I was in DC, actually, we had some time off in the afternoon, so I would walk around and go to used bookstores. And I went to this used bookstore, and I bought a copy of James Merrill's The Changing Light at Sandover. I don't know if you guys know about this book.
Mm-mm.
It's an epic poem. It's 500 some pages long, 560 pages long, but much of it is his and his partner's conversations they had with spirits or whoever they were through a Ouija board, right? And so I'm reading it because I'm thinking, I was thinking about the thing with Dee and this, and if William Butler Yeats' book, Vision, which is also a kind of, that was through automatic writing, conversing with the invisible realm. And one of the things Yeats says in there is, one time it went on for months that they realized they had been led astray by some spirits because you can't see them, right? And I'm reading this James Merrill book, and it's a fascinating thing because it's all in it's formal verse. It's all in formal verse, sestinas and blank verse and stuff, and it's interesting. And I'm trying, and I was going to stop reading it, and I was like, I have to get to the end of this because I have to see the phenomenology of this, because Merrill didn't, and I've seen this happen before. Something happened to me when I was in my 20s, is that people start in those kinds of communications, and at first they're like, yeah, we're your friend and everything, right? And then it gets weird. And this is what happened with John Dee at first, and he did it with, I think, noble purposes in mind. He really wanted to heal the rifts of religion and politics in Europe. And his assumption was that if he could recapture the language of Adam, the Enochian language, that would be the key to uniting Europe, right? So in these spirits he was conversing with through his medium and a crystal ball,
the spiritual Esperanto.
Well, yeah, that's it. And they promised him that, right? And he didn't get that. What he got was they eventually told him to swap wives, and this is God's will. And he's like, but I'm a Christian, and this is against the commandments. Yeah, the commandments no longer apply to you. So okay, right? And that's
what
how
happened to Alan Watts. Right? That's what happened to Alan Watts.
Incrementally, yeah, exactly. So I'm kind of interested in how does this happen? It's so dangerous, and I've had students say, Ouija board Professor Martin said, do me a favor, never.
Now can we all just stop for first of all, it's funny, I think I may have told this to Nate before, but what I was talking to Malcolm Guide about Alan Watts, and I was so excited to finally find someone who have read a lot of Watts, because most people and I said, well, what happened to him? And he was very aggressive in his reply. Malcolm Guide being a great Anglican priest who, helped convert Martin Shaw. I mean, the neo-pagan guy, a really interesting, and Jungian also. And Guide said, first of all, he should have read Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Pastoral Letters, where he says that the job of the pastor is to take the hand of Christ, put it in the hand of the person, and walk away. And second of all, and this was the really killer line, he just looked at me, smiled. He's like, he never learned to be ordinary.
Yeah.
He had to be on his houseboat with Timothy Leary and Ginsburg talking about open marriages and how they'll save the world. And trust me, even though those have been re-released on podcast, those conversations have not aged well. Yeah. Because get them talking about, you just wait till they talk about race. Oh, and you're just like, and then they talk about women, and you're just like, wow, you guys are very dated right now, especially the open marriage thing. Sorry, you're not the gurus that we once needed. He blew it. It's an object lesson for all of us.
Yeah, I certainly think, and I've been talking with the task of the demon or of Satan is to convince us that good is evil and evil is good, right?
And
this is the world we live in right now.
Well, okay, and here's the moment. I feel like I've learned how to share YouTube clips, right? And you just take, and I feel like I want to take what Michael just said and share it as a YouTube clip for this conversation, because anyone kind of listening to this might say, "Oh my gosh, tarot! These guys are tinkering around with the demonic," and you just heard precisely the warnings that people put on the tarot, but instead put onto Ouija boards and casual forays in the spiritual realm. Mm-hmm. This conversation is imbued with precisely that fear, godly fear, but the very thing that sometimes people assume is demonic, Tomberg is aggressively Christianizing, which is what makes this so amazing. It's the ultimate undercover job. If you walk down to the Quest Bookshop in Wheaton, where the Theosophical Society headquarters in North America are, this is prominently featured. And I guarantee you they have not read it, because if they read, well, no, maybe they have, maybe there are some Christians there, but it's so fascinating that, just like he says, I'm not going to dismiss all of Greco-Roman mythology or all of Tantric Buddhism as demonic. I'm not going to dismiss the arcana of the tarot as necessarily demonic, because I'm too busy Christianizing them.
And it came out of a Christian culture.
Yeah, because it's the Marseille tarot specifically that he's writing these meditations on.
So here's some interesting trivia.
It came out of a medieval world where Christian symbolism had not been lost. So the cards contain symbols that are Christian symbols. So it's not like he's not reinterpreting it. Right. He's actually giving you what the actual meaning of the medieval symbols.
You know, speaking of the Quest Bookshop,
are not aware of.
Right, they're not aware of that.
Yeah.
Speaking of the Quest Bookshop, so I told Nate knew about this, but last Friday I gave a lecture on this book at the Theosophical Society in Detroit.
Oh, really?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, there's some good stuff that happens there, because they kind of know Blavatsky plagiarized, and they're just like, all right, we're ready to entertain some other things. It was
an interesting. It was a good experience. I saw some people I haven't seen in 30 years.
But cool.
But yeah, I mean, so on the same topic, right? So a person who comes up over and over again in this book, Eliphas Levi, right? Alphonse Louis Constant, who had been a deacon. He would ordain deacon in the church. And who's very Catholic. And in fact, one of his books, he says he submitted his books to the Inquisition, or the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, right? And they said, well, we think it's extravagant, but they didn't condemn it. But here's the thing. Now, I found this a few months ago. He wrote a book before he was still in the seminary, while he was still in holy orders, on the Virgin Mary. Really? It's a sophological text. And I have it in French, and I haven't had a chance to go through it yet. But I would love to get somebody like Jonathan Geltner to translate it, because I think it would be important to. And it's not very long, maybe 150 pages long.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Levi? So all listeners who are not aware of him know that now he's a deacon, but he was also, what was he, a cult figure?
So what happened with him, as far as I know, he fell in love with a woman, so he stopped pursuing the priesthood, and he realized he had a different vocation, and eventually he was part of the French occult revival. So he was, I think, a little bit older than Rudolf Steiner. Steiner was born 1860, I think. Levi was born in the 1820s or 30s.
Okay.
And then he was like the forefront of this revival in ceremonial magic, and he wrote several books on it that were widely read during the occult revival of the 19th century and into the 20th. And his transcendental, I don't know can't remember what the title is in French, but it's translated as Transcendental Magic, which is very much like Meditations on the Tarot, because each chapter starts with the tarot card, right? A meditation upon it.
And that's the kind of, and basically what magic is, it's cultivating powers of active imagination.
Yes, exactly.
And so, and now, so Levi is referenced, and then Tom Berg's like, all right, now let me bring you into the harbor of the church here. Let me bring you in, because you know, it's a dangerous thing to cultivate. And that, I mean, really, when you, and that's the thing, people, there's just this repulsive fear, but when you actually begin to ask the questions, like, oh, all magic is cultivating these things that are very dangerous to cultivate, but you can also cultivate them for good, with the caveat you don't invent saints, you don't invent the church. Like, that's, you know, it's like that. It is a given. It is not your typical academic would think it's all just a construction. But Tom Berg, of course, it's not all a construction. Anyway, very interesting. I wish that the academic discussions could take this into account. It would be a lot more interesting if we had this middle layer of the egregore when we're talking about the demonic and the angelic and these things. But again,
that's one of the ironic things about the chapter, is that the title is the devil, but it turns out like it's not about the devil at all.
He has too much respect.
Yeah.
Too much respect to deal with that topic lightly. And that's why, because he wants, if it was, then it would demonize the tarot card, which he wants to redeem.
Right.
Very interesting.
And that's why he turns to Levi and Josephine Paladin, who were these kinds of occultists in the occult revival, who were also totally dedicated to the Catholic Church. So it's kind of a weird mix, right?
Yeah. Wow. So much more we could talk about here, guys.
That's what we could.
But there's more conversations to come. It is so fun to pinch hit for Shari, but I look forward to hearing her again.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what Shari has to say about this one.
So one thing before I don't know if we're going to cut it out in a second, but
no, I got time. If you guys
on page,
point?
No, please keep going.
Now, one of the things, the practical things he talks about, right? We were getting there earlier, right? How do you deal? What do you do when you have to deal with one?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Close off this here.
Psalm 68, right?
Psalm 68, and
north, south, east, and west, 4 directions.
And he says there's
the sign of the cross.
Make the sign of the cross towards the north, south, east, and west. Each time saying the first 2 verses of Psalm 68, and it's power, and it works. Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. Let those who hate him flee before him.
And
holy water away, so drive them away. His wax melts before fire. Let the wicked perish before God. It works.
And then the triple spit.
Yeah, that one.
I must admit, I haven't tried that one lately. Yeah, the triple
I
spit.
have done the triple spit.
I don't want to do it in my house. That's the problem. So.
Yeah, I have done it and it works. But now, interesting. I don't know if you
guys goes back to the mystagogical catechesis lectures of Cyril of Jerusalem. I mean, that's what it's what they're all doing is they come into the church.
And this
you
is actually
spit at the presence of the devil.
That's what happens in the Orthodox Church. You still do it when a baby's baptized. Right. And on Easter, on the Easter Matins, in the Orthodox Church of the Byzantine Catholic Church, this is part of when they open the tomb. Actually, what's the doors of the church, and they and it's profound. And this is what they chant. It's let God arise. It's heavy.
Why do you think it works? That's because
of the rule, the presence,
because of the word
presence. Presence. It's not a formula. It's not an incantation.
This is why I want.
It evokes the presence.
That's
the presence of good is what causes evil to run. Right.
And it's
just
the
presence of
and
good.
it's right. And it's possible that another set of words might have the same impact. Right. From, let's say, a set of words that another tradition has for the same purpose of casting out an evil spirit.
And the other thing
that another set of words could work too.
As the secret weapon.
This is what I was talking about.
There it is.
There it is. Secret weapon.
Go ahead, Nate.
No, but as Christians, these are appropriate
Well,
for us.
and it's so
But I just want to
funny.
make it clear that I don't think Tomberg is suggesting that it works because it's a formula.
No, it's
I
not
don't think
magical.
that's what he's saying.
It's not
Right.
magical. And what really irks me, I remember listening to this Hillmaniac, I should say, Jungian, who I mean, thank God this particular analyst is being reconciled to Christianity to an extent because she knows Jung so well. And so she cannot deny the power of the Christian myth, but she was describing reluctantly going to her grandson's baptism or something like that in a Catholic church. And she just, in this haughty, just embarrassing way, just, oh, and then they said, I renounce him to Satan. And oh my gosh, how unsophisticated from a Jungian point of view. It's like, you're just so, I mean, you just don't, I mean, here's what I want to say to her. Yeah, I don't think you've been in the office enough. Give yourself another 10 years with not just the rich patients that come to you.
Mm-hmm.
Give yourself some more time, and then you will encounter something that the Jungian playbook doesn't permit you to combat. And I guarantee she's probably already have that level of experience. This is what M. Scott Peck, this is why he chastised the American Psychiatric Association at the end of his career. And he said, look, we all know, if you've been in this long enough, that yes, there are a lot of people that say demonic far too quickly, and we've overcorrected, but we know there's, and he used the figure 2%, where you encounter something, not just someone, and it's more powerful than any of the clinical tools that you have at your disposal. And he said, why can't we at least evoke the common possibility throughout human history that this might in fact be a demonic entity? Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because we'd be out of a job, because then we have to appeal to authority higher than psychiatry.
Right.
And he just called them out. And I want to say, that's what you're renouncing. You're not renouncing the shadow. And yes, Christianity perhaps does have some problems with not fully assimilating the shadow, but the shadow is not the devil. The shadow is not evil. We have to have that distinction that sloppy Jungians don't have between pure evil, which can never be assimilated, must be rejected and renounced, and the shadow, which is just human sin that one acknowledges as in the light of grace and forgiveness.
Well, there has to be light. There has to be light to see a shadow.
Right. Right.
That's why it's just shadow. It's not pure darkness. You can't integrate darkness.
No. And that's
no light whatsoever.
And so the rite of exorcism is far wiser than some slapdash Jungian analyst who thinks that she's hot stuff because she's been at this for a decade. It's like, you just know nobody's smarter than a tradition that's been around for this long.
Yeah, and nobody's smarter than a fallen angel, right?
Seriously.
And that's
raw intelligence and manipulative power.
And this is exactly what happened. So all the people I just mentioned who were dabbling in kind of spirit communication, they were all smart people.
Of course they were.
And they all got led astray, right? Because demons have this in common with academia, is that their main tool in that way is ridicule and trying to prove us hypocrites, right? Because this is the hierarchy of the left. This is what I'm talking about. That's kind of their job, right? They don't believe, as Tomberg says, they don't doubt God. Man is who they doubt.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's part of the project. There is
that's why they try.
And he points out
they find our weak points and exploit them. Yeah,
I can't remember. Is it in this chapter where he talks about this guy who'd been communicating with spirits and went on for a long time, and he put out all these books like this? I bet the Seth material is like this. I'm sure, where they just kind of like, yeah, I'll get you some more material. Yeah, let's keep going. It leads you along, then it leads you to despair. Is what happens. Right, leads you to nothing.
Oh, we talked about the guy who wrote the Osiris Revelation.
That's the one I'm talking about. Yeah.
Well, and this is why, and John Calvin cites. It's really interesting. It's in his chapters on justification. He cites Bernard of Clairvaux for reasons that will be obvious when I explain the quote where Bernard is confronted by the demonic with his own sin, and he just says, "I plead the wounds of Christ, not my merit."
Right.
And so this is, you could see why Calvin would jump on that. But the
Yeah.
point is that this is a common motif. Catherine of Siena does the same thing. When confronted with your own weaknesses, the appeal is to, I'm not here on my own authority. I'm here on the authority of Jesus, and I have been forgiven I plead the blood of Christ on the cross. You
Right.
can see, and I might say, as an Anglican myself, I think that people think, oh, the doctrine of justification is sort of this invented thing. And like, no, I think it's kind of a Pauline thing. And when it has power in the spiritual realm, that might indicate some truth, right? Is that you really are saying that the only reason I have anything to say in these spiritual realms is because of the shed blood of Jesus on the cross. And you evoke that, and all of a sudden the demon's got nothing, right? Because he wanted to point out your mistakes,
right?
Which, if you talk, the Monsignor who's written these books about exorcism, he said, if I go into an exorcism with even a little bit of anger, it will be exploited.
Yeah.
And so you go, and you're not on your own authority. And that's why if you go into the jungle, you better have a pretty, solid Jeep and maybe a rifle next to you. You don't just wander into it to encounter creatures of the forest. You will get bitten.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing about
there's a line in here about there's a line, I think he's quoting someone about like that you don't have to, it doesn't matter whether you believe in tigers or not. If you run into a tiger,
they will still eat you. They will still eat you. And so and so we need to be sort of scanning the horizon, and we should never seek it out, right? But the people who are responsible exorcists, and by the way, Nick Rapatrizzoni, really interesting editor at Image Magazine, if you want to read a great article, he wrote an article called The Obsession, where he did some original and brilliant, painstaking research. In 1973 in San Rafael, California, this was the actual house that inspired Amityville Horror.
Mm-hmm.
And he, the movie just completely botched it. But he looked into the Jesuit who actually performed. It's not a possession. It actually, the technical term is the obsession, where a house is completely overwhelmed with evil. And they called in this battle axe Jesuit. And let me just say, they don't make Jesuits like they used to, who basically summoned the entire church to be praying and succeeded in exorcising the spirit. But it is a harrowing read. And you cannot read this and not be convinced in the reality of some kind of power that exceeds egregores, right? Mere egregores that really are tangling with us. And you just like, it causes me, I just go back to the hearth. When I see the weather out there, I go back to the hearth of the power of Christ. And it's our only hope. I mean,
I'm glad you mentioned this, because two figures, Malachi Martin, for instance, right?
Oh.
So hostage to the devil.
Totally.
I mean, talk about Irish Jesuits, right? But also William Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist and the screenplay, that was based on, a real event.
Yeah.
And he was and I saw an interview with him one time. It was really fascinating. He was a student at Georgetown University, which is why The Exorcist takes place in Georgetown, and which is a Jesuit school. And one of his professors, or two of his professors, they had been the Exorcist working on this boy. It was actually a boy in Georgetown. Oh. And it took them like a year and a half to get rid of it, and they finally did get rid of it. And they told, I don't know if they told the class or they told Blatty, but they told them, which said it at that moment. He said, "I thought I had to write this as a story because it's such a fascinating story," right? And like you said, they don't make Jesuits like that anymore. No. They certainly don't. But there's something.
Maybe they do, but they're just they're not the most vocal ones.
I was fortunate enough to have a very old school German Jesuit that I interacted with at Thomas Aquinas College named Father Gerard Steckler, who's since passed. He was quite elderly even then in the early 90s when I was there, but he was definitely an old school Jesuit for sure.
Can I ask so Malachi Martin, I remember just being, kind of never getting I've seen those books, never fully getting my mind around him. Wasn't he kind of out of step with the Catholic hierarchy? Like, what's the deal with this guy?
He was critical. I mean, he was critical of the Catholic hierarchy because he thought that the hierarchy had been infiltrated by, I don't know if it was communists or who it was. I haven't read the book either, but I met him once.
Oh, what? No way.
What an intense cat he was. And really, I mean,
like he's one of his books is hostage to the devil.
Isn't he the one who said there was a vampire cult within the church, though? Isn't that him?
No, I don't know about that.
I think that's him.
But
he claimed that
but he was actually
clergy that there was a vampire cult.
I was part of an audience at a television show in Detroit. I was about 25 or 26, and they were talking about the New Age and demonic possession. And I was just kind of stupid and naive, and I was probably even younger than 25. I was probably 23, and I asked him a question. I said, well, it was, it was just a naive 23-year-old thing to say. I said, isn't the problem that we're being judgmental and we should really wait to see what's going on? He goes, hey, listen to me, son. The devil's real, right? And I can't remember what he said to me, but I remember when he spoke to me, I was
good
like,
for him.
I felt like something come out of me. And
then
I went,
for him.
After that, right after that, I went to like a cafeteria kind of place or like a bagel shop, and I got a bagel and a coffee, 2 bagels and a coffee, and the price was $6.66. So
well,
but the cat made an impression on me, that's for sure.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like, it wouldn't surprise me if he didn't. Let's imagine he did get into the weird, vampire cult stuff. It's like, when someone has an impact like that, you often see these charismatic, powerful figures who are given gifts for the church, and they do go off the rails later. But you don't have to judge someone by just what happens at the end. You can get them at, like, for example, when it comes to Martin Luther, like, don't follow the late Luther on anything.
Well, to be fair here, based on what Tauber says in this chapter, if your job within the church is constantly confronting these forces, which are admittedly not healthy to be thinking about, there'll be a cost, right?
There'll be a huge cost.
So one would expect that it would be possible that, there would be likely that they would go off the deep end, so to speak.
Well, and doesn't that mark everything about this letter? It's that he knows the cost and he is trying to prevent us from paying it. Let's let's be so careful in talking about it. I'm grateful that same caution, I hope, has marked our conversation and is marking it. Instead of, just when you deal with real evil, the psychic toll is enormous. Absolutely. Even if you are tethered to the power of Christ. So we must be so cautious in this regard. And thank God, if you haven't encountered any of these beings, right? What a gift, praise God for that. That's a normal human life should be protected and insulated from these demonic realities. But they should certainly not be sought in any sense. Even egregores, right?
So do you think there's an argument to be made for the idea that engaging with the pretend evil that we have in horror, despite what you guys said about your childhood trauma earlier, might be like a better way of approaching it than maybe sort of inoculating against the possible encounter with the real? Or do you think it's just that there's nothing good to be said for it, that we should probably avoid?
Well, it depends. I mean, there's horror and then there's horror, right? Now, I haven't seen The Exorcist since I was 15, or I was probably 17, because I saw it when I was 14, and then I saw it again when I was 17 in high school. And but in the past years, I saw a couple of these newer Exorcist movies. There's one, what's it called? The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which was kind of I kept wanting to say, you guys should have consulted me on the script, because some of these things are implausible. But the other one was Deliver Us from Evil, I think it's called, which is both directed by they both directed by the same guy? Deliver Us Evil is actually based on a New York cop named Ralph Sarchi, who was was as a cop, he was dealing with people who were actually possessed. And he, you know, it's his kind of his story about, it's a fictionalized account of his story, but in the DVD for it, you get in fact, you can find it on YouTube. At least you used to be able to, where he talks about being this, he's like a really New York cop, you know what I'm saying? And he's talking about dealing with the devil. So I think in one sense, I mean, it's complicated, because I think in one sense it's helpful to know that stuff's out there and that there's a way to combat it through the sacraments and through Christ, right? And which is what happens in both of those examples. I mean, there is a Christian subtext.
There's an element of hope, right? So in a
Yes.
horror that would be acceptable for a Christian audience, there has to be an element of hope and
redemption, right?
Christ has to really be able to triumph over these things.
And I think the film The Exorcist, it ends.
So to me, a film that is
redemption.
truly inspired by the hierarchies of evil would be one that leaves you in despair.
Yeah, like those Nightmare on Elm Street things, right? That's just gross.
Yeah, but I don't really think it's. I think it's just kind of, to me, those are just funny.
Produced by Wheaton College, by the way, because he went to Wheaton, and then there's Elm Street is in Wheaton.
Oh,
okay.
He started to write like edgy stuff for the Wheaton Record or whatever, or the Wheaton English Journal or whatever, and so he got disciplined for that, and then his whole career was rebellion.
Oh my!
Yeah, so you can thank us for that.
Yeah, I think those ones are just bad and like somewhat unintentionally funny, but they don't like. There's no despair.
But what I think there's not, and what happens is I think it makes evil not threatening.
Oh, okay. So there could be a danger,
right? So then
gotcha.
And I have seen young people, especially young boys, get overwhelmed by that stuff. And here's an example. So this happened, and this actually connects all of this. So I had a
so we don't want hopelessness, but we don't want evil to seem approachable and cute and cuddly either.
No, so here's when I would go. So I had this research assistant while I was working on this submerged reality, I believe, and she was this young woman, really one of the, probably the smartest student I've ever taught at any level. Really wonderful person, but she had a boyfriend who was like in this kind of death metal band, so they had all the demonic paraphernalia in their set design, and this guy didn't believe in anything. Right. He didn't.
A lot of Satanists don't. They're just materialists with cosplay.
And he was he was doing the cosplay thing. And what happened, she said that she felt that there's something really evil in her basement, because she would go down there to do laundry, and she's like, Professor, and this is the one tough cookie, this girl, and she was like, Professor Martin, I can't do it. What should I do? I said, well, okay, so here's what you do. Go to your, because she was Catholic. I said, go to your Catholic parish or your mom's Catholic parish or whatever. Get some holy water.
Of course, yeah.
I said, and then I gave her Psalm 68, and I said, read what it says here in Meditations of the Tarot, because she was really into the book. So she did that in her basement. In a few weeks, she left her boyfriend, right? And I think it was a good move. And eventually, get this, I gave her a course on this book, a directed study at Marygrove College in Detroit, Michigan. It's about probably 10 or 12 years ago now. But it worked, it worked for her. But the thing is, I think what happened with her boyfriend is that stuff's not to be played with, that imagery, right? We're talking about active imagination. And if you put your imagination in a dark place,
so I have to ask though, but what about Black Sabbath? To me, like if you take a song like War Pigs is a great song against the egregores. And Ozzy Osbourne is a good Anglican.
Interesting.
But yeah, they have like, this dark doom metal kind of vibe. But is that really something that,
Yeah.
I mean, which side is that on?
Well, sometimes, what is that in the Screw Tape Letters, where there's the advice to the junior demon, like keep people about in the middle. Don't let them be too sinful, because then they'll flip. And so with, sometimes people who really, drink the bong water, they'll oh gosh, and then they'll jump back. Case in point, Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings, right? They invent Dada out of a absurd protest of everything, and then they convert to Catholicism.
Yeah.
And then all these other, Dada enthusiasts, they just, just a little tokes. And so they never realize what they've taken in. And same with T.S. Eliot, right? Writes The Wasteland, becomes an Anglican. And so so Ozzy Osbourne would be an example, right? He sees the darkness maybe, and then has to come back. So that's interesting. But in regard to horror movies, like, why would you ever want to impose upon yourself what Michael and I have both shared of, psychic damage that takes, that you're still wrestling with? I would never invite that. The last horror movie I saw, which I felt like I had a professional obligation to watch it, was The Unholy. And what was really interesting, Nate, according to your diagnosis, it does conform, because it's with the Walking Dead guy, and it's all about the Virgin Mary. And it concludes, not in a note of despair, it concludes with a quotation from the Gospels, do not believe every spirit. And it's just, in other words, like the demonic could be anywhere. But the movie itself essentially makes the case that the Virgin Mary is a demon.
Oh boy.
Jeez.
And so all of a sudden, the confusion that I'm imagining a young person watching that movie thinking like, gosh, if you ever talk about Virgin Mary, that's obviously just a portal to the demonic realm. And there's all there is there's no possibility of a redemptive figure.
But I don't think anything
of
can
Mary.
be less anything that casts like dispersions like that on the Virgin Mary. I don't think anything could be less hopeful.
But
Right. And so unfortunately,
here...
so it really is. I thought I would go so far as to call it a dangerous movie. But especially when you begin to work on active imagination in your prayer life, these movies can really scramble your signals.
Yeah.
You've got I've gotten I have a really holy and brilliant academic friend, Timothy Larson, who writes all these OUP books. And he said it beautifully, finally explained it to me, like back when I would like watch Pulp Fiction indiscriminately. And he said, when I was young, I would watch these movies because I wanted to understand how the world works. But he's like, now I know how the world works. And I don't need to be told this is how evil things are and how bad humans are. So, I don't need that.
I think maybe there's a reason why, like, it seems like the population that seems to be most obsessed with these kinds of things are younger males.
Yeah.
And I think maybe for younger males, like that little bit of like, there's something, maybe that's needed and it's appropriate developmentally for that
weird.
age.
No, I don't think it works that way. I think what happens.
You don't think so?
No, I think it's
if it wakes someone up to the reality of the spiritual world, it can be good. But
I think what the thing is, it's like with little kids when they start imitating Darth Vader, like, dude, it's the wrong guy, right?
Yeah.
And the reason the children do that is because they fear it. It's a Stockholm syndrome, right? They fear this dark evil, so they try to embody it as a way to dispel the fear.
Exactly.
And I think that's what,
and they're attracted to the power
death metal and
too.
stuff like this, right?
Well, I think this may be one of the most beautiful moments in my life. I was sitting in it, and I actually recorded it, just because I could, and I wanted to. I was just, it was so. I'm sitting. My son was maybe about 4, and he's sitting there in the corner singing this song to himself. And anytime watching like your most innocent animated movie, if any plot thing comes up, even now he's 7, that it all involves difficulty, he'll run into the other room, right? Any kind of fear, or there are movies that are just like Home Alone. Not even we are not there yet, right? Home Alone would be over the top for him, too scary. And so all this to say, you might say, okay, fine, he's a kid, but listen to this. He's in the corner singing a song to himself, and I started to listen to these lyrics, and he said, the song was, so he creates almost this hellscape in which the devil was in the depths of hell, and in the monster's foot, was he starts like describing this, and I'm like, what's going on? And deep inside the monster was the very light of God. And I'm like,
Really?
God. I was like, what is
Wow.
happening? It's an exorcism that he's doing in his imagination
Mhm.
to say that even God would challenge anything demonic and evil. I mean, it was like my kid was Origin, the conversion of Satan.
Mhm.
I'm like, I was overwhelmed that the mind has to do that. The Christian mind has to do that. And so my rule for popular culture that I need to, because when I get tired, sometimes I just want to watch a show, and I'm doing less and less of that, is that you cannot, as a serious Christian who wants to be one, and I understand the gradations of Christianity are challenging, but Tomberg lays them out. You can either be fighting against the lust of the flesh all the time, or you can graduate from that and begin to deal with these more challenging issues that when you can do more good for the kingdom. So let's just take that at face value. If you want to do that, then nothing that you can watch should be unmetabolizable. You have to metabolize it. And that might require some serious prayer and reflection where you invite the light of Christ into that very film. You should be doing this with your dreams. Of course, you should be doing it with your dreams. That came from your own psyche. And so you might need to have an active imagination session where you resume the dream as the Jungians teach you, and you invite Christ into it in a conscious way. This is a teachable skill. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like, why would I ever watch anything? And I talk to people in their 30s, and they're like, oh yeah, I watched this. I'm like, how? I don't say it out loud, but I'm just like, I could not
it's
bear
interesting.
it.
The thing that terrified me as a child was not anything with any kind of supernatural evil, but human evil. It's like anything.
Oh, yes, this is the worst kind.
Anything with Jack the Ripper, I had to watch it. It was like a train wreck, but it terrified me at the same time.
Yeah.
Like the idea that human beings were capable of such evil was just like I couldn't stop looking at it, and
Totally.
it terrified me. But
and that here's the scare, that we are capable of that evil.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Is that's in us.
Right.
That's, I mean, I don't want to make myself purer than I am. I did watch a good bit of The Walking Dead in the early years, but the first thing I learned was you should fear human evil more than zombies walking around. Those are easy.
Right. Well, this is evil, part of what Tomberg is saying when he's talking about egregores too, because the hierarchies of the left, they can't kill you.
Yeah.
They can make you despair and want to kill yourself.
Yeah.
But they can't kill you. But egregores can kill you.
Yeah.
And they've murdered millions.
Yeah, we haven't talked about
egregores
communism.
Are responsible for the Holocaust. Right? Egregores are responsible for what Stalin did.
And this is one of the most subtle and beautiful analyses of Marx and Engels that I have read. Mm-hmm. And of course, still traffic in fashion in academic circles. They should read this chapter. It's like, isn't it interesting that his analysis of Marx and Engels comes in the chapel, the chapter dedicated to the devil. Very interesting.
And these egregores are still with us now. That's what's driving what's going on in Canada with the aid and dying.
Oh yeah, my goodness.
Oh gosh, what talk about despair.
Yeah.
Incentivizing people to end with despair. Oh my God.
That actually might be the hierarchies of the left, in fact, beyond egregores, because of that, because it actually is like persuading people to end their own lives.
Yeah.
And it's despair focus.
Right. I have to go up there. Ever since Michael referred to it as the maple curtain, I love that. I've used that so many times. Like, we're going up to the maple curtain. Be careful. Don't get in a car accident. If you don't die in the car accident, they'll kill you in the hospital.
That's pretty much the truth. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like that scene. I don't want to go on the cart. Right, from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right?
Yeah.
That's Canada right now.
Oh gosh,
I feel happy.
Yeah,
that's funny.
Oh my gosh, we laugh, but it's terrible.
It is
terrible.
It's pretty horrible.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's our job to confront it. So It's the collective job of the church to do so, and let us be a part of it. There's that wonderful passage maybe we can conclude with where he simply says, what you should be wanting to, Marx and Engels invented something. They irresponsibly generated an egregore, which was not a smart thing to do, and it caused untold suffering. And it's not that you can't have criticism, but he said that would have been responsible, and the Christian church does that, but they turned it into an egregore. And he has this wonderful line where what we should be doing is trying to contribute to the continued health and sustaining of the great cathedral of mankind's spiritual tradition, and let us try to contribute to it. That's our job, right? Oh, right. Gosh, that was on page 409 and 410. Really good.
The great cathedral. Yeah.
Very good.
We covered it, guys. We covered it,
guys.
We did it. Thanks so much for stepping in for us today, Matthew. Appreciate it.
My delight.
Yeah.
All right. I look
2
forward
days
to
in
the
a row,
resumption.
Man.
Yeah, that's right. I look forward to the resumption of the normal programming.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Take it easy, guys.